We actually have figured out basically the same technology that makes babies young to now apply to us as adults. And more health in life is actually a good thing, not a bad thing. Somehow that cell becomes young again. We're just curing blindness, right? We're talking about giving people extra decades of life.
We're here at the Transvision event in Madrid with Michael Ringel of Life Biosciences. Michael, thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Really great.
Yeah, so I was talking to you yesterday, and now we're just going to have the whole conversation again on the camera, because I was very interested in what you do and how you came about doing it. It's a very intriguing story. So for the sake of the viewers, tell us a little bit about you. How did you come to be in the longevity field? What was your inspiration?
Yeah, and likewise, your origin story was great as well. I guess we won't discuss it on camera this time, but it's really fun to hear how everyone gets into this, right? So my own background, PhD biologist, did my studies at Harvard, Princeton, and Imperial, which is in the UK. I spent 25 years at Boston Consulting Group, BCG, which is a large consulting firm. And I did a project for a client who was interested in the longevity area and, assessing, is there something that they can do to bolster the field? That led to creation of a foundation, which, I'm glad to say is still running strong. And actually they asked me to join the board of that in the US. But more importantly for me personally, it led me to do a full scan of all the technologies that are out there. And I just became convinced that partial epigenetic reprogramming, which I'm sure we'll talk about, is a technology that has incredible promise to address all the age-related diseases in principle, potentially aging itself. And, I couldn't just sit at my consulting job when I had that knowledge and not get engaged on it.
Because you were in the consulting firm for a long time, right? It kind of became redundant and a little bit of a drag at some point? Or?
No, I mean, I really loved it. 25 years is correct, and really great years. I mean, it's an incredible group of people, lots of great work done. Of course, if you're in any job for 25 years, you start to get a little used to it. But no, I was really happy there. It was much more the pull of I had to get into this aging
I see.
the opportunity when I saw it.
So once your eyes were open to that world, it was just you were drawn into it.
Exactly.
Kind of similar to what my story was as well.
Exactly.
So how did you come across meeting David Sinclair and getting into Life Biosciences if, that wasn't your first move because you started the foundation with your previous client? So how did that transition happen?
So I'd known David for a while, but essentially, once I'd identified this technology was where I wanted to be active, I just reached out. And, David's obviously the founder and chairman. Jerry McLaughlin is the CEO and, also someone who was friendly with and knew. And so, reached out and just spent time talking to them and eventually, pulled the trigger on joining when we identified, there was a place where I could be helpful to them.
Okay. And what do you do within the company?
So I'm chief operating officer, which is basically a jack of all trades. So
okay. So you do whatever needs to be done. Yes.
Exactly.
Okay. Understood. Yeah. So what is I'm sure Life Biosciences as a whole is doing a lot of different things, but what's the main project going on right now within the company?
Right. So our goal is to address age-related diseases with approved therapeutics that have gone through proper testing with the FDA and other regulatory agencies. That means there's a whole slew. I mean, there's hundreds of age-related diseases. Depends on how you count it. You could go thousands. And so we want to tackle them, ideally not all one by one, but certainly starting with at least individual ones. The first ones we're going after are blindnesses, which are incredibly debilitating. So we're starting small. We're just curing blindness, right?
Okay.
So nerves don't regenerate after damage. There are a couple of different ways that what's called the retinal ganglion cells, but basically the nerve cells get damaged. One key way is glaucoma, which many people have heard of. Typically pressure builds up in the eye, and that damages the nerves. There's another one called Nion, which most people not have heard of.
I haven't heard that one.
Non-arteritic anterior ischemic optic neuropathy. It's quite a mouthful.
Yeah.
It's basically a stroke that damages the optic nerve. Same thing, right? Different. It's not pressure. It's a ischemic event, a lack of blood flow. But ultimately, the end result is the same. The retinal ganglion cells, which are responsible for transmitting the electrical signal back to the brain, are damaged. Our therapy has the potential to, we believe, make cells younger, and young cells heal themselves. And so the first indications are these optic neuropathies, but we've also disclosed we're using the same exact approach, and I'm sure we'll talk about what the approach is, but using the same exact approach, and we've disclosed now liver disease, so fatty liver disease, one of the most common severe diseases that affects adults, age-related disease. You would be surprised, to say the same drug works on both glaucoma and fatty liver disease if you don't understand the mechanism, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But we've got great data now, preclinical data, in both these indications. In the case of the optic neuropathies in mice and non-human primates, so monkeys, which is highly predictive of results in humans. And in liver, we've disclosed mice data. So we're going to be going into the clinic expected Q1 of 2026, so in just a few months.
Okay.
With our first clinical trial for these optic neuropathies to address blindness.
Okay. Well, I want to put a pin in that because that's very exciting, but I want to back up a second and talk about a distinction you made of you want to tackle age-related diseases, preferably not one by one, as you said, but, kind of starting there. Is there a reason you want to go after essentially just age-related diseases instead of, classifying, as a lot of people at this conference would, aging is a disease and just attack that?
Well, look, there's a tremendous moral imperative in helping people who are suffering from an ailment. We want to make sure we're doing that. We're addressing unmet need. There's very clear value proposition for the people involved, right? If you're already suffering from a condition and you can get relief from it, potentially have your sight restored, that's incredibly morally compelling. It's obviously also one where there's a clear regulatory path. There's financial clarity in terms of how that plays out. There is a long-term potential to say we could do, a whole body rejuvenation. Technically, that's not possible right now. You'd have to be able to deliver the treatment to all cells more or less equally. It's not something that we have the technology for yet. It could be something down the road, but right now we're really taking mainly a cell type by cell type / organ by organ approach, depending on which organ we're talking about. So it is still a bundle. In this case of optic neuropathies, we're talking about glaucoma and Nion, and we expect there'll be a few bundles like this as we go for additional diseases going forward.
Okay, so this is touching on something that we kind of got into yesterday, and I want to go back into it because it's a very fun discussion of, you're going into specific age-related diseases because there's a clear regulatory pathway already, and therefore also investment capability there. But with aging as a whole, there's not something that's already there. It's not something we have yet, so there's a little bit more of a muddy water there.
So it's not. I really don't think this is about blaming the regulator. I'm a big believer in proof, evidence-based medicine. So you have to show safety and efficacy. So there's just a fundamental hurdle in doing I'm going to keep you young trial, because I would have to run that trial for 50 years, right? So before we would have the proof, we'd have to wait a very long time. So it's not to say you can't do that, and that may be in the future at some point, but that's much more of just that's just a law of reality, right? If I want to show that I can keep someone young for a long time, I would have to run the trial for a long time before I had the proof. I know there's some, tendency to blame the regulator, but I don't think that's really appropriate in this case. I think this is an issue of it actually does take time to run a trial like that, and there's not a really good feasible path to it right now. So
trying to understand where you're coming from, because I'm sure in this space, people very much disagree with that. There's people out there like abolish the FDA and And what we were talking about yesterday, I agree with. You can't have just pure anarchy in this field, because then you have people who come in just wanting to make money and knowing people are gullible in mass, well, assuming that, I guess. And just trying to sell whatever they can sell that sounds good in order to make a buck, but it's actually doing more harm than good. And we definitely don't want to allow that into the space. We were talking about something that happened fairly recently, actually, with some injections that people had taken and ended up in the hospital. But is there something to be said, and I'm very interested in your take on this because you're probably more closely connected to it than I am, but is there something to be said that, yes, we maybe need some regulation to filter some of that junk out, but is there maybe too much regulation on things that are potentially good but can't get started because there's too much of a first hurdle?
So I think there's plenty of discussion even within the agencies on what you might call regulatory reform. So there's a belief in something called disclosure regulation. So there's different ways you could regulate things. But so for instance, the SEC, which regulates financial investments, really focuses on what's called disclosure regulation. So that in the early days, there were, in fact, lawsuits brought on, I paid too much for this stock. And the courts decided that's just that'll be a quagmire to get into. So we're not going to try to mandate what the right price is for stocks. What we are going to mandate is that the purveyors of stocks, the companies that are trying to get investment, have to disclose material information. They can't withhold disclosures, and there's a set of information that they should be disclosing. And that's really that's been embedded now, obviously starting by law, but the administrative state that has grown up around that with the SEC ensures that investors have a fair understanding of the information before they make the investment, and then they're treated as adults to make their own decision. And I think there's a very parallel path there within the FDA to say we want to make sure there's a package insert that provides all the information that would be necessary to make a decision, typically to a learned intermediary, whether that's a nurse practitioner or a physician, or in some jurisdictions it could even be a pharmacist, to assist with making that kind of decision. So it's very much around ensuring the right tests have been done to show efficacy and safety. The right write-up has been done to put that information in a usable form, and then let the user decide. Essentially, this is a user in consultation, obviously, with the learned intermediary.
Okay, so just trying to play devil's advocate and give a little bit of voice to the other people that are inside the room there. It makes sense because the FDA has a lot of surrogate endpoints and precedent on how pharmaceutical drugs work within the body. And so it's very easy to say, well, if you can hit these biomarkers, then that shows there's efficacy in this new drug you're trying to, get manufactured and pass. But when it comes to genetic engineering and cell rejuvenation and things like that, there's not a whole lot of precedent. So it's harder to determine what the surrogate endpoints are. So to my understanding from having listened to some of these people, because I'm no expert in this field, but from what I understand is the default then is to go back to the same surrogate endpoints and biomarkers as pharmaceutical drugs to try to compare newer therapies to that when it's comparing apples to oranges. And again, being a layman here, what's your take on this?
Yeah, so there are actually very few what's called surrogate endpoints. Typically, the endpoints that are used in a clinical trial are ones that are functionally meaningful endpoints to the patient. So if I think about blindness as an example, can the patient read lines of information? You've probably seen an eye chart, right?
Right.
How far down the eye chart can you go, right? And there's other measures beyond just the simple eye chart. But functionally, can you see or not? That's totally independent of the mechanism of action, whether it's a gene therapy, whether it's a cell therapy, whether it's a monoclonal antibody, whether it's a recombinant protein, whether it's a peptide, whether it's a small molecule. Don't care. But I want to know that the patient is able to see.
That makes perfect sense.
And that's the standard, and that's the standard that all medications should be held to, regardless of mechanism of action. And so it's really it's much more around functional benefit for the patients, and of course, obviously showing safety. Right, you have to test against basically look for any potential safety signal and report those that are observed. So I actually think the process is reasonable. But there may be certain indications where that's okay. You need to adjust it a little bit, but it's really agnostic to the modality. It's about showing that you're actually benefiting patients.
Okay. So to shift a little bit here then, because I'm starting to understand where you're coming from more. So another part of this being, sure, the regulation maybe isn't necessarily the issue in every case. Maybe sometimes it is. But sometimes maybe it's a therapy that's trying to be pushed forward is actually not as effective as the creators would like it to be. And that's where the rub is. But is there another side of that where it could be effective and show efficacy, but because of high regulation causing high cost to go through trials, they can't afford to go through even that first stage?
For sure. There are situations where there are medicines that could be tested that are probably not being tested because of the cost thresholds involved. The most obvious example of that are drugs that are already generic or natural compounds that are not patentable. Clinical trials are expensive, and if the financial return is not there because you don't have the sort of pseudo monopoly that you get with an IP protected agent, at least for a short period of time, then the incentive to spend that money to do that development obviously is not there. So there are situations like that. There are ways to address that. For instance, the government could actually fund those trials. In some cases they do. Philanthropies could as well. So there are situations like that. I I would love it if we found ways to do trials more efficiently.
Yes.
As would, I think, the regulators. And there is work in that regard as well around what AI can do, what things like basket trials where you combine different agents together and do trials together, which saves some costs. There's lots of efficiency that we can do in the way our trial system is run, where we have thousands of different investigators at different hospitals, different clinics, all running things differently. They have separate institutional review boards. They have sometimes faxing to get information back and forth. It's a somewhat antiquated system. So there are definitely improvements that can be made to kind of bring those costs down. I think it'll still be an expensive proposition because you have to obviously find thousands of people and treat them and gather the data in a well-controlled way. The drugs themselves typically are expensive as well at that stage. So it's not like this is going to become a free enterprise to actually run clinical trials, but there should be ways we can make it less expensive.
Okay. So coming back, we put a pin in it earlier. So now let's pull that pin and let's get into it. You said Q1, you're hoping to go into clinical trials for fatty liver.
No, for optic neuropathies.
And
we're in research for fatty liver disease right now.
Oh, and research. So Q1 is the optic thing
correct,
you're going to go into. So going into that, you're fresh into beginning clinical trials on something. So what was your experience in getting approval to go into trial with the regulators and working with them?
We're in our process right now. So we expect to file for the IND relatively shortly. Of course, there's a review process, and we can't speak for the FDA, so we're not privy to what that review process will say. Given we've had pre-IND meetings, so the sort of preparatory meetings with the FDA, we don't expect any surprises, but it's their right to review the data and make those determinations. We're very confident in the strength of our preclinical package. In addition to the mouse data, which showed reversal of blindness, complete reversal of blindness, right, to full restoration of vision. As well as a very good safety package where, there were no adverse events, no serious adverse events. If anything, some of the things we want to look for, like risk of pluripotency, there was no nanog expression. There was, if anything, a reduction in tumor frequency, certainly not an increase. The data that was seen in mice, we've now essentially recapitulated in non-human primates, where we've seen really beautiful data showing restoration of visual function, where the nerves have an electrical impulse, and a wave. You've probably seen, heart beating, that sort of thing. It's similar. Um, the animals after being blinded, really, there's almost no electrical impulse coming out, and then after treatment, there are situations where it's restored all the way back to a youthful baseline. So, really great data showing efficacy. I'm also happy to report that we finished what's called our GLP tox, which is what's required for an IND submission, and top line results is no serious adverse events. So we're confident there's a good data package that will allow us to bring these therapies into trials with humans. But of course, that's TBD at this point.
Right. So I don't know if this is something you're able to answer or not, but I'm going to ask, and if you can't answer it, just tell me. But do you know the anticipated cost to taking that from going into clinical trials in Q1 all the way through to it's marketable now?
Yeah.
And
so millions, tens of millions, really. So trials themselves are expensive. Our therapy is an expensive therapy to make. So it's quite complicated. It's a dual vector AAV system expressing an AAV cassette. From a patient perspective, it's great because a single injection, and then after that, you just take oral doxycycline, which is a commonly prescribed antibiotic. You actually take it at half the dose that it's prescribed as an antibiotic during the period that you want the treatment to be active. Once you stop, treatment's no longer active. So from a patient perspective, it's simple, but from a manufacturing perspective, it's actually very complex. So there's a lot of cost in that. I can describe what the underlying technology is, if that's helpful. Yeah. An everyday fact we all know is that babies are born young, but they just come from us, right? There's no like magic extra ingredient that appears. It comes largely from an old egg cell with a little bit of contribution from a male. And somehow that cell becomes young again. A woman of whatever age of childbearing age as an adult, the baby is absolute zero, right? And how does that happen? Well, we actually know how that happens. So on the DNA, there's something called epigenetic marks. These are methyl groups and acetyl groups that are on the DNA itself. They're on the histones, which the DNA is wrapped around. And between day 7 and 9 of embryogenesis, those marks are wiped clean. So actually, for the first few days after the egg is fertilized, it's still old. But then between day 7 and 9, it's wiped clean, and basically the cell is told you're young again. And the cell then behaves as if it's young again. So if the parent had an age-related disease, dementia, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, right? The baby does not. There may be some sequelae from that. There may be some consequences, but the baby doesn't inherit those diseases directly, right? They might inherit a genetic disease, but these diseases of aging, epigenetic diseases, aren't inherited. And that process, that natural process of how you reset a cell to be young again, we know how to manipulate artificially. So Shin Yamanaka won the Nobel Prize in 2012, showing you could treat cells with just 4 small proteins, abbreviated OSKM. Those proteins run that reset process. And so when you do that, you can take a cell of any age and turn it into what's called an induced pluripotent stem cell. People focused in that discovery on the fact that these are pluripotent stem cells, but hidden in this discovery is that those cells were young again. So if you grow a clone from one of those stem cells, the clone is born a baby. Even if I could take a skin cell from your wrist right now, run it into the lab. It's not ethical to do it with a human, but run it in the lab through this process and grow a clone, and that clone would be a baby, even though you're not a baby. So the issue is it can't do that in your body. I can't treat you with OSKM in your whole body because you can't turn your whole body into stem cells. That would be a problem. But the discovery that's the root of our technology is that if you just treat cells with OSK, so drop the M, that 4th protein, the cells don't go all the way back to stem cells, but they go back to a younger version of themselves. You wipe the marks, but not all the marks. And that was a profound insight. It was on the cover of Nature in 2020. And that's the basis of all this technology, which is we actually have figured out basically the same technology that makes babies young to now apply to us as adults and make us not young, but younger. And and thereby address age-related disease.
Okay, I think Life Extension Magazine also wrote an article about that, OSK without the M and all that. So yeah, it's definitely getting out there. So that's what you're about to take into clinical trial. That's the science that's based on, is the Yamanaka
Exactly.
factor?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
that is very interesting.
Yeah.
There was one point you made, and I wanted to bring it up, and let me see if I can recall that back real quick. No, I kind of lost it. Anyways, so you said tens of millions of dollars is what you anticipate going from here to a marketable product, and that's if everything goes well, or if there's other issues. How did you come up with the tens of millions figure?
Yeah, that's a very typical cost. Frankly, I'm probably lowballing it. Hundreds would be kind of fairly typical. There is also what you call the capitalized cost of R&D. So unfortunately, many things fail. On average, only 1 in 10 drugs candidates that start phase 1 actually make it all the way to market, because the things we think work don't always work. And if you add up all 10 failures to get to one medicine, then you multiply the cost essentially by 10. It's not exactly like that, but roughly. And so the capitalized cost of R&D is really in the billions of dollars, which is why it's such an important industry for us to make sure there's a way for investors to recoup the money. So these pills in our case, is a little bit different, but these pills can be very cheap to actually manufacturing, but they cost billions of dollars to figure out what to make. And so there has to be an economic system that supports that innovation while also keeping costs low for patients. And so that'll be something, I think, for society to work through.
I was reading actually, I'm still reading the book, but it was mentioned in there a little bit about that. There's a lot of failed attempts before a successful attempt finally comes about. But then when figuring the cost to the patient for that treatment, it's included in the cost to recoup for all the other 10 failed attempts. And so that's why there's some exorbitant prices for some things and not so much for others, especially when it comes to generics, because they wait I think it's 7 years before generics are able to come in and make the same type product.
It's an important issue for us to work through, because nobody wants to pay a lot for medicine. Nobody wants to pay a lot for anything, but particularly medicine, where for many of us it feels like a burden. Like, I really wish I didn't have to have this disease at all, and now on top of it I have to pay for it, right? So there's a lot of especially when budgets are stretched, anxiety around cost of medication. Now the reality is medicines are less than 10% of the cost of healthcare. Most of the cost of healthcare is in hospitalization and all the services around it. So medicines actually save the system money by kind of preventing those other downstream costs. But of course, from a patient perspective, you don't always see that, right? You're seeing what's hitting your wallet of those medicines. So there's a real need to ensure there's not too much burden on patients. But at the same time, if there's not an incentive,
it's got to be economically viable,
right? There has to be some way to incent innovation, and there are different systems. You could say the government's just going to pay for it, fund it.
But where do they get the money?
Right.
That whole question.
Or you have this system where you try to recoup those costs of R&D on market, and there are situations where the pricing is probably not tantamount to that recoupment. It's too much. You have very old drugs that are still charging a lot of money. That's probably a situation where there's an imbalance there. But we also shouldn't demonize the industry. It really is one of the few industries that actually helps a lot of people. And there does have to be a way for investors to recoup their investments. Otherwise, they won't make them. And then we won't have new drugs coming out. So we basically stop innovating if we no longer fund R&D.
And some people would say they've seen that. I think starting back in 1962, there was some amendments that went into play in the FDA, and because of that, there was actually a decline in innovation compared to what was projected from that period. I don't know. I haven't looked at the data myself to be able to vouch for the validity of that, but it's an interesting discussion nonetheless.
Yeah, there were more trial, safety, proof of safety required now, but that's because of things like thalidomide, where drugs were released not in the U.S. actually, but overseas, and a lot of people suffered as a result of that.
That was horrible,
right? So there is a reason why we want to have trials to show safety and efficacy.
Okay. And I remember the point I wanted to bring up earlier. It came back to me is the matter of ethics. You were talking about you could take a skin cell from my wrist and go clone it. That wouldn't be ethical. But that raised the question in my mind of the ethics around longevity. There's a little bit of a debate on ethics in the longevity field, and I kind of think that as this actually becomes more popular, there's going to be more of a heated debate on whether or not it's ethical to extend human lifespan longer and longer and longer. So what do you think?
And it's a super question. I'm really glad you asked it. I'm not an expert in this, but I happen to be married to one. So my wife is a bioethicist who teaches at Harvard.
Oh, great.
Who I've gotten, interested in the question. And she just wrote a piece with Art Kaplan, who runs the NYU division of bioethics. They actually added me as a co-author as well, in a quite prestigious bioethics journal called the Hastings Center Report, where they really address this head on. And it drives me nuts that people think this is somehow unethical. Like, health and life are, most people agree, inherent goods.
Right.
And more health and life is actually a good thing, not a bad thing. And there are things that people raise, it's unnatural, it's going to cost us money, it's only going to be for the rich. And those arguments are generally wrong.
Yeah.
Actually, it's easier to do prevention than it is, cure, right? An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So it'll actually be easier to democratize medicines that work before you have disease to keep you young and healthy than it will be to do these end-stage treatments that, try to save you at the last minute. So that's the sort of billionaires. No, actually, it's going to be easier to democratize. In terms of actually costing the system money versus saving money, keeping a bunch of old people alive. What this actually does is keep people productive and healthy, and they're actually able to work longer if they want. They're able to consume longer. They're costing the system less in terms of healthcare costs and entitlements. So, and there's a whole list of these arguments, and she really quite methodically goes through them one by one to debunk them and come back to the fundamental premise and point that health and life are good things, and we should be supporting them.
I think the toughest ethics argument out there, and I'm interested to hear your wife's take on this, and yours as well if you have one, is the religious argument. Because it's hard to argue that, because you don't want to smash somebody's belief, because it's obviously benefited them, otherwise they wouldn't be believing it. So how do you have a conversation with that and show the ethical side of it?
Well, so we're not talking about immortality. We're talking about living longer and healthier, which is already what we do. So if you go back 100 years, we died about 40 years earlier.
Some people argue that is not ethical too on the religious stance.
So, I think that's where you are. You're at one of those two ends. Either you say, I reject all medical intervention. Antibiotics, liver transplant, whatever it is. Or you say, okay, this is just another medical intervention that extends life and health, but we're not denying death. And so it's no different of a kind. It just feels different because we're at the point where it's new to us, right? And what, like 100 years ago, we've been new to the people then, like all these newfangled antibiotics, right? So I think it's that mindset. Now there is a reasonable point to say, well, no, I reject all intervention whatsoever. Well, then you shouldn't have
personal choice, though.
You shouldn't have tap water. You shouldn't, right? Like all intervention, right? Is that's I think a valid point of view, but a relatively difficult one that I think few people would subscribe to.
To push that a little bit further, if you look back over the years, we have been steadily extending lifespan in the healthy years through, having clean water and hygiene and, pharmaceutical drugs and these things. So is it so much of a stretch to say it's those same processes, just a further scientific evolution
it's
to
another step?
Actual immortality, or is that a different ethical conversation?
Well, I think it's a different ethical conversation. Again, it's not my area of expertise, but I'll give you the practical answer, which that's just not. It's against the laws of physics. Whether it's against the laws of God or not, I'll let other people decide. But
so physical immortality is against the laws of
impossible.
physics.
Yeah.
Can you being a non-scientific mind, can you explain the physics there?
well, at some point the universe ends. If you go all the way out to the end of it, right? You say, okay, there's unlimited energy, whether it's a heat death, whether it's a collapse, whether it's a rip. I don't know.
Something.
But
okay.
So that's obviously a very extreme limit. But even well before that, we're not talking about immortality. We're talking about giving people extra decades of life,
Okay.
and extra decades of health.
So when you think of life extension, just on a personal note, are you thinking, let's get people to a healthy 120, a healthy 150? Where's kind of the cap you're thinking?
I'm not going to put a number on it, but I think realistically, it's not numbers incredibly different from what we've experienced already.
Okay.
But TBD, right? It's a little bit of an open scientific question.
Once we get further along in society, then we'll see further as well. So that makes sense. I think we've taken a long time in this interview, longer than we anticipated, but this has been a wonderful conversation.
That was great.
I appreciate it.
I really appreciate it. You
I want
asked
to
great
continue
questions.
this on more, but thank you so much
thank you.
for coming on.